It was barely 6 a.m. when she stepped through the wrought iron gates of the Blackwell estate, her sneakers damp with morning dew and her heartbeat loud enough to drown out the birdsong. No one knew her real name here. She preferred it that way. To the staff, she was the new girl. To the butler, the quiet one. To the CEO who lived in the penthouse above them all, she was invisible. She had been scrubbing marble floors and dusting gold-framed mirrors for 3 weeks now. No one asked her where she came from. That was fine. If they knew who she really was, everything would fall apart. Not yet. Her shift began in silence, as always. She tied her hair into a low bun, clipped on her ID badge that said Clara M., a name borrowed from an old childhood storybook, and slipped into the uniform that felt more like a costume than anything she'd ever worn. As she climbed the grand staircase to the east wing, she passed a portrait of the man who owned this house, and half the city. Julian Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Capital, tech visionary, heir to scandal, cold as January steel. She had only seen him in person once, when she accidentally spilled coffee in the main hall. He didn't yell, he didn't curse, he just looked at her like she was dust on his shoe. Since then, she'd made sure to be a shadow in his world, until today. By noon, she found herself in the upper library, polishing, sorting books alphabetically by an author list she'd memorized after hours just to fit in. And that's when she heard the door open behind her. Footsteps. She turned slowly, cloth still in hand, and nearly dropped it. There he was, Julian Blackwell, in a tailored navy suit that looked like it cost more than her entire hometown. Sharp jaw, glacial blue eyes, a stare that pinned her like a butterfly. "You," he said, "what are you doing in here?" Her voice stuck in her throat. I was assigned the upper library today." His eyes narrowed. "You moved Austen to the top shelf." "Yes, sir, that's where her works are usually. She belongs next to Bronte, on the second row. This is a British classics section, not a free-for-all." Her cheeks flushed. "Apologies, sir, I'll fix it." He looked at her like he was still deciding whether or not she was worth further words. Then, abruptly, he turned. "Make sure it's done before my meeting. And don't touch the Defoe first editions. They're worth more than your annual salary." She bit her lip. If only he knew how wrong that sentence was. When he left, she allowed herself a slow exhale, and a smirk. First editions? She had one in a storage unit in Paris, signed, in original leather binding. He had no idea who she was. That evening, Clara changed back into her clothes, jeans, hoodie, and sneakers, and headed out through the side entrance. The other staff walked, took the train, or carpooled. She slid into the back seat of a sleek black sedan that waited a block away. The driver tipped his head. "Back to the penthouse, Miss Leclair." She hesitated before replying. Not yet. Take me to the old office." As the car pulled away from Julian Blackwell's mansion, Clara Leclair, only daughter of the late Etienne Leclair, founder of Leclair Global Holdings, stared out the window at the glowing skyline. Her voice was soft, but sure. "It's almost time." Julian Blackwell didn't like being late. He didn't like clutter. He didn't like warmth. He didn't like people who talked too much, smiled too easily, or touched things that didn't belong to them. Which is why, as he stood in the East Wing kitchen that afternoon, holding a fine porcelain teacup with a fresh chip in the rim, his jaw clenched like stone. "Who made this mess?" he asked, his voice low, even, dangerous. 3 staff members stiffened like soldiers. The butler, Mr. Hale, tried to smooth over the tension with a polite cough. "Sir, I believe the new girl was assigned cleanup duty this morning." "The cup may have—" Julian didn't wait for the rest. He found her in the gallery hall, wiping down a frame near a canvas of muted ocean gray. "You," he snapped. Clara turned, startled. She straightened immediately. "Sir?" He held up the cup like a weapon. "This was a De Winton original, 12th in the series. Do you know how much it costs?" Clara's eyes flicked to the chip. Her voice was calm.
I imagine less than the Rembrandt in the East hallway, but more than the Daumier you keep above the liquor cabinet. Julian blinked. What did you say? She dropped her gaze quickly, hiding the fire that had almost escaped. I apologize, sir. It won't happen again. But the damage was done, not to the cup, but to his certainty. There was something about the way she stood. Not fearful, not defiant, measured, controlled, like someone used to power, but pretending not to be. That evening, Julian reviewed security footage out of pure spite. What he saw wasn't what he expected. He watched the moment the teacup slipped from the tray, not from her hands, but from an unstable table leg she had tried to balance. She caught the tray. The cup tilted. She lunged to catch it, failed by a second. The chip happened on the floor. But what stunned him most wasn't the accident. It was her face afterward. Not panic, not guilt. Grief. She picked up the broken piece and held it like it mattered to her, like she'd just failed herself, not him. The next morning, she was in the library again, this time arranging books with surgical precision. He walked in unannounced, then stood, silently watching her from the doorway. "I moved Austen," she said without turning. "Second row, beside Bronte." Silence. He stepped closer. "Do you read them?" he asked. She paused. "Every night. I grew up with them." Unusual for someone in your position. Her shoulders stiffened. "Yes, sir." He didn't know why he said it next. Maybe the guilt, maybe the curiosity, or maybe the loneliness he never admitted. "I chipped that same cup once," Julian murmured, "years ago. My mother had it repaired and told me to pretend it never happened." Clara turned to face him, unsure how to respond. There was something strange in his eyes, not softness, but a crack, the first real one she'd seen. "Would you like some tea, sir?" she asked gently. He nodded, once. And for the first time in years, Julian Blackwell drank tea with someone, not out of habit, but choice. That night, Clara wrote in her journal, "He's still cold, still proud, still infuriating. But I think I saw something today, beneath the ice." Clara M. Julian read the name aloud from the staff roster, leaning back in his office chair, brows furrowed. "No last name?" Mr. Hale cleared his throat. "Just the initial, sir. We haven't pried. She was hired through the agency when Mrs. Delaney left abruptly." Julian didn't know why it bothered him. Staff came and get. Names were a formality. But something about this one, her, didn't sit right. Meanwhile, across the estate, Clara stood beneath the chandelier in the ballroom, holding a feather duster in one hand and a mental map of her next 10 lies in the other. She'd been summoned for cleaning duty, but it felt more like surveillance. Every security camera had been re-angled. Every hallway had new eyes. They were getting suspicious. She checked her reflection in the glass-paneled wall. Not for vanity, for control. The uniform sat perfectly. The posture was right. Her accent had never slipped. Still, it was only a matter of time. That evening, she slipped out of her uniform and into jeans and a faded hoodie, ducking through the side exit again. But this time, someone followed her. Julian had planned to go for a drive. Instead, he saw her leave and made a snap decision, one he would have scolded himself for later.
His car trailed the cab she took into the old quarter of the city, all the way to a small antique bookshop nestled between 2 shuttered cafes. He watched as Clara slipped inside, hugged an elderly woman, and disappeared among the shelves like she belonged there. A minute later, the sign flipped to closed. Clara didn't notice the man across the street. She only felt the weight of the day fall away the moment she entered the sanctuary of leather-bound covers and warm dust. "Aunt Evie," she whispered. The woman looked up, smiled. "You look tired, Cher." "I saw him again today. Julian Blackwell. He's curious." "You knew that would happen." Clara nodded. "I just didn't think I'd start to care." Evie tilted her head. "About him?" "No, about what he thinks of me." Silence. "That's the most dangerous part," Evie said gently, "when you stop pretending for them and start pretending for yourself." Outside, Julian still sat in the car, engine off. He watched the shop's window glow in amber tones. He didn't know why he couldn't look away. There was something about her there, different, unmasked, like she belonged to a different world. A world he couldn't buy. Later that night, Clara returned to the estate, and so did Julian, earlier than expected. Their paths crossed in the empty corridor near the west stairs. She froze. He raised an eyebrow. "Out for a walk?" "Fresh air, sir." He stepped closer. "You speak like someone who isn't used to being told what to do." She smiled faintly. "You speak like someone who isn't used to being questioned." He almost smiled. Almost. "What does the M stand for?" She held his gaze for a beat too long. "Maid," she said. "Isn't that all that matters?" It started with a note, folded neatly on a linen napkin in the East Wing dining room. No signature, just 4 words in clean, slanted handwriting. "Library, 6 p.m., J." Clara stared at it for longer than she should have. It wasn't an order. It wasn't part of the schedule. It was an invitation. And it terrified her more than any command ever could. At 5:57 p.m., she entered the library. He was already there. The room smelled of old paper and expensive bourbon. The fireplace flickered behind him. The shadows carved his features sharper than usual, or maybe it was just the silence between them. Julian looked up from the chair near the fireplace. "You came," she replied softly. "No, I asked." She paused, unsure how to respond. "I've been thinking," he said. "You know things most people in your position don't. The Defoe reference, the Austen cataloging, the wine you corrected the butler on last week, Chateau Margaux, 1982 instead of 1984. Clara held her breath. "You don't read like a maid," he said, "and you don't move like someone used to being beneath people." She tilted her chin slightly. "What if I just read a lot?" His eyes narrowed. "And what if I just believed that?" He stood and walked toward the small table between the chairs. There he poured 2 glasses of red wine. Clara raised a brow. "This is highly irregular." He held out a glass. "So is a maid quoting Baudelaire in 3 languages." She didn't take the glass. "Why am I here, Mr. Blackwell?" "Because I want to know who you really are." She finally took it. "And if I don't want to tell you?" He looked at her, for once, not like a CEO assessing risk, but like a man searching for something he couldn't name. "Then, they'll have to earn it." They sat. The fire cracked. The wine breathed. Time slowed. Julian spoke first, about Paris, where he once studied finance and walked past the Seine without knowing what it meant to feel anything. Clara told him a story, a made-up one, about growing up in a crowded flat with too many siblings and not enough books. He smiled once, she laughed once, and neither of them noticed that an hour had passed. Or 2. But later that night, in her small quarters on the staff floor, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept hearing his voice. Not the cold CEO bark she was used to, but the low, thoughtful one he used when he asked, "Who are you hiding from?" She had no answer. Meanwhile, in his penthouse suite, Julian stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline he usually ruled with steel certainty. And for the first time in years, he felt off balance. He didn't like mystery. He didn't like doubt. But he couldn't stop thinking about her, the woman with no name, no past, and 1,000 walls in her eyes. The next morning, a new staff schedule appeared on the bulletin board. Under personal library maintenance, one name had been penciled in by hand. Clara M. Daily. Indefinite. Rain slammed against the glass like it was trying to get in. Not a gentle drizzle, but a violent, slanted storm that blurred the skyline and washed the world in gray. Clara stood in the glass solarium, polishing the windows that wouldn't stay dry for more than a second. The storm mirrored her thoughts, relentless, confused, loud. She shouldn't be here, not this close, not this scene. "You're early," came a voice behind her. She turned. Julian stood beneath the archway, shirt sleeves rolled up, tie gone, hair slightly undone. He didn't look like a billionaire right now. He looked like a man in a storm. "I like the rain," she said, returning to her cloth. "You don't strike me as the sentimental type. And you don't strike me as someone who notices what time people arrive." He smiled, the rare kind, the kind that didn't reach his mouth, but cracked open something behind his eyes. "Come here," he said, motioning to the center table where 2 cups of something hot were already steaming. Clara hesitated. "I'm not luring you into a trap," he added dryly. "It's just tea. And a conversation you won't let me walk away from. I never said I was fair." She sat. The storm roared around them, wind shaking the glass walls like nature was protesting this closeness. He watched her, quietly. "You're not like the others." She sipped her tea. "No one is." "You know what I mean." Clara placed the cup down carefully. "Then say it." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You don't flinch when I speak. You don't try to impress me. You correct me, challenge me. You read more than I do. You know things you shouldn't, and you wear it like armor." Clara met his eyes. "That's not a compliment. It's not a warning either." She held his gaze. "What do you want from me, Julian?" He blinked. That was the first time she'd said his name. Not Mr. Blackwell, not Sir, just Julian. It did something to him. Something he wasn't ready to name. The air between them was different now, thicker. He looked away first. "I don't know yet." Later that night, when the storm settled and the glass no longer trembled, Clara stood in her room, staring at her reflection. She whispered her real name, just once, to the empty air. Clara Leclair. The name sounded foreign now, and yet he made her want to say it out loud. Meanwhile, Julian stood in his private study, hands clasped behind his back, watching the dark windows. He didn't understand her, but for the first time in years, he wanted to. He didn't know her secrets yet, but he was starting to realize he wanted to be the man she trusted to tell them. Birthdays meant nothing to Julian Blackwell. They were dates his assistant remembered, events his investors exploited, and nights full of handshakes with people who didn't care if he lived or died, as long as his empire thrived. This year was no different. The guest list was curated by his publicist. The venue, his private rooftop garden, the one Clara had never been allowed to clean. Until today. She arrived in the morning with a list and no explanation. The staff whispered. Some stared, but no one questioned her orders. She arranged centerpieces, directed catering layouts, adjusted wine pairings. Every detail handled with cool precision. Julian watched her from the shadows of the garden entrance. She moved like she had once hosted galas of her own, not served them. And for a brief moment, he didn't see a maid in uniform. He saw something royal. By sundown, the rooftop shimmered in amber light, fairy lights strung across glass walls, a string quartet tuning quietly. Waiters in black and gold moved like dancers. Clara stayed invisible until she couldn't anymore. "Stay close," Julian said, finding her near the back exit just as guests began arriving. "I wasn't planning to stay at all," she replied. He looked at her. "You planned this entire thing. I want you to see how perfectly you executed it." Her throat tightened. "This isn't my world." He leaned in. "But you fit in it better than I do." That scared her more than it should. Hours passed. Julian made his rounds, short, sharp, formal. But every few minutes, his eyes found her. In the corner by the champagne tower, by the orchids she'd arranged herself, in the mirror's reflection behind the bar. She never smiled, but he never stopped looking. Then came the incident. A guest, some smug tech investor, spilled vintage wine across Julian's lap, laughed too loud, joked about getting the help to mop it up. Julian stood so fast, the man flinched. But before he could speak, Clara was there. Calm, precise. She wiped the stain gently, eyes down, only to whisper where only Julian could hear. "Let me handle it, sir." He said nothing, but his entire body went still. The man laughed again. Didn't know CEOs let maids talk back. Julian stepped forward. "Careful," he said coldly. "She's worth more than everything you own." The man blanked, and Clara looked up, stunned. Later, after the party dissolved into glittering smoke and string music, Clara stood alone by the garden railing. Julian approached, slower this time. "You didn't have to say that," she said. "I meant it. I don't belong in your world." He paused. "You've been pretending you don't, but the truth is, you do. And I think I do too, only when you're in it." She turned to him, lips parted, searching his face for lies. She found none. And before either of them could second-guess it, he said the words neither expected. "Don't disappear after this." That night, in her room, Clara sat in the dark, still in her gala uniform, still hearing his voice. Don't disappear. Too late. Because what she feared more than being caught was being seen. Julian Blackwell had never believed in love. He believed in leverage, contracts, profit margins. But love? It was a liability. A myth sold in movies and overpriced novels. His parents had proved that. So had every woman who ever saw his last name before his face. Until Clara. He caught himself doing things he would have scoffed at a year ago. Lingering near rooms she was in. Noticing when she wasn't at breakfast shift. Letting his meetings run long, just so he could run into her by accident. He hated it, and he couldn't stop. Clara, meanwhile, was running out of places to hide. She couldn't deny it anymore. He was looking at her differently. But worse, she was looking back. She watched him read by the fire with a hand curled at his temple, brows furrowed. She saw the way he tucked his cufflinks precisely before a meeting. How he softened, subtly, when a stray dog wandered into the estate gardens, and no one else noticed. He wasn't who he pretended to be. Neither was she. One evening, in the West Corridor, she passed by the music room, a place usually locked and silent. But tonight it wasn't. Soft piano chords drifted into the hall, hesitant and searching. She stepped in. Julian sat at the grand piano, back to her, playing slowly, not like a virtuoso, but like a man remembering how to feel. He didn't stop when he noticed her.
"I didn't know you played," she said gently. "I don't, not really." He kept playing, just enough to keep the silence from swallowing them. She moved closer. "Why now?" He didn't look at her. "Because I needed something that doesn't talk back." She almost smiled. Harsh, but true. "And does it help?" He pressed a dissonant chord. "No." Silence. Then he said, softer, "But you do." She froze. When he finally turned to look at her, the room shifted. "I don't know what this is," he admitted, "but I know it's the first thing in a long time that doesn't feel like a deal I'll regret." Clara stepped toward him, slowly, carefully, like walking toward a ledge. "I'm not who you think I am," she whispered. "Good," he said, "because I'm not either." He reached out, just lightly, and touched her hand where it rested on the piano. It wasn't a kiss, it wasn't a confession, but it was the start of something real. That night, Clara stood beneath the estate's night sky, heart tangled in something she couldn't name. She whispered her father's name for the first time in months. "Forgive me, Papa," because she had come here for revenge, to expose Julian Blackwell. But she never to fall for him. It came in the form of a letter, unmarked, no return address, slipped under her door in the dead of night. Clara stared at the envelope, heart hammering in her chest. The handwriting was unmistakable. Etienne Leclair's lawyer, her father's estate, her old world, clawing its way back. She opened it with shaking fingers. "You've been found. The board is asking questions. We can only keep the silence for so long. A." Her hands trembled. Everything she'd built in shadows was about to burn in the sun. Meanwhile, Julian's week had been chaos. A surprise audit, a breach attempt at the Singapore office, his CFO threatening resignation. But despite the noise, his mind kept circling back to her, Clara. The girl with secrets in her eyes and grace in her silence. She was the only part of his life that wasn't falling apart, and that terrified him more than anything. They met again, unplanned, in the old greenhouse, now overgrown and half forgotten. Clara sat on the wooden bench, letter tucked in her jacket, trying to breathe. Julian stepped inside, startled to find her there. "You okay?" She didn't answer right away. Finally, "Do you believe in ghosts, Julian?" He frowned. "No. Why?" "Because sometimes I feel like one." He stepped closer. "Where's the fire, Clara? What are you always running from?" She closed her eyes. "A version of me I can't erase." Julian sat beside her, close enough to feel the tension in her shoulders. "I don't care who you were before this." She turned to him. "You should." "No," he said firmly, "because I know who you are now." That broke something inside her. Not because it was a lie, but because it was the truth he didn't know yet. Later that night, in his office, Julian pulled out his private laptop and searched for her name. Not Clara M., but Clara Leclair. It was a guess, a wild one, but when the results appeared, articles, inheritance notices, a missing heiress rumor, his chest tightened. The next morning, she found him waiting in the solarium. He didn't speak. He just held up a single printed headline. "Heiress vanishes after father's death. Billion-dollar empire left in silence." Clara's face drained of color. He looked at her like she'd betrayed him. "Who the hell are you?" Silence. It filled the solarium like smoke, thick, choking, impossible to ignore. Clara stared at the headline in Julian's hand. Her heart beat so loudly she thought he could hear it. "Say something," he said, voice cold. But she couldn't. Not yet. He dropped the paper on the table between them. "All this time, you let me think you were someone else." She met his eyes. "You never asked who I really was." "That's not good enough, Clara."
"I didn't come here to lie." "Then why did you come?" She hesitated. Then, finally, "To decide if you deserved to lose everything." The air cracked between them. Julian stepped back like she'd slapped him. So it was revenge. "At first," she admitted, "you ruined my father. You buried his company. My family lost everything." "I saved that company," he said sharply. "It was bleeding debt. Your father—" "My father was proud, kind, brilliant, and you crushed him to protect your shareholders. I followed the rules. So did he. He just didn't have your claws." The storm that had threatened for chapters finally broke. "You infiltrated my home, lied to my staff, slept in my house. I never took a thing from you. You took me." His voice cracked on that word. Clara's breath hitched. "I didn't mean to." "But you did." He turned away, ran a hand through his hair. "For a moment, I thought I could love you." The words were quiet, but deadly. She blinked, stunned. "What?" "I let you in, and you used me." "No," she said. "Julian." "Don't." The word stopped her. Not because it was cruel, but because it sounded like a man breaking apart from the inside. Later that day, Clara packed her things in silence. No one stopped her. No one spoke. Not even Julian. Especially not Julian. As the car pulled away from the Blackwell estate, Clara turned to the window. Tears she didn't know she still had finally fell. Because she hadn't just lost a battle. She hadn't just failed a plan. She'd lost him. And worse, she had no one to blame but herself. Meanwhile, in his office, Julian stared at the cracked teacup she'd once broken. He picked it up, gently, turning it in his hand. Then, without thinking, he whispered, "Come back." 3 days. That's how long it took for Julian Blackwell to realize he had ruined the one thing that didn't revolve around his empire. The boardroom felt colder. His penthouse felt empty. And everywhere he turned, he saw her. Her laughter in the corners of rooms. Her scent in the library chair. Her absence like a bruise on every surface. He'd built empires, closed billion-dollar deals. But he couldn't undo this. Clara, meanwhile, had returned to a world she no longer fit. She moved into her family's ancestral townhouse in Paris, now cold, hollow, and watched closely by the same lawyers who once whispered in her father's ear. They wanted her to rejoin the board, wanted her to reclaim the Leclair name, but she couldn't stop thinking of his. She tried to forget, tried to bury herself in charity galas, legal disputes, foundation meetings, but every time someone asked her a question, she answered with his voice in her head. Every time she sipped red wine, she remembered his hand pouring it, and every night she heard him say it again. "I thought I could love you." One rainy afternoon, Clara sat on her father's old balcony, letters stacked in her lap. One of them was still sealed, unopened since the day it arrived. It was from Julian, handwritten, no return address. She hadn't had the strength to read it. Until now. "Clara, I don't know how to start a letter to someone who broke my heart by telling the truth, so I'll start with this. I deserved it. You came into my world like a storm I didn't see coming, and now I don't know how to live in the silence you left behind. I don't know what your real name means, but I know what you meant to me. If there's any version of this story where I get to see you again, not as my maid, not as a threat, but as you, please let me find it. J." Her fingers trembled as she read it. It was everything she had wanted to hear, and the last thing she felt ready to believe. But the truth was, she wasn't angry anymore. She was just tired of pretending she didn't miss him. 1 week later, Julian returned to the greenhouse. It had been abandoned since she left. Dust gathered on the piano keys. Ivy wrapped around the broken railing. And on the wooden bench, folded perfectly, was a scarf. Hers. He sat, and for the first time in his life, he waited. Julian didn't know how many days had passed since he first sat in the greenhouse. It had become a ritual. He'd arrive just after sunset, sit on the cracked bench where Clara once whispered riddles and half-truths, and wait. Not for her. He wasn't that naive anymore. He was waiting for something to break inside him. But it never did, because hope is stubborn. Across the ocean, Clara walked through a world that once belonged to her and now felt too small. Every board meeting reminded her of her father. Every charity gala reminded her of how much she'd changed. She smiled for the cameras, for the headlines, for the lawyers who'd protected her secrets. But behind every smile was a question she couldn't kill. What if it's not too late? Then came the news. A press article, short, unassuming, buried beneath market trends and mergers. Julian Blackwell to step down as CEO of Blackwell Holdings. No explanation, no press conference, no scandal, just silence. Clara stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. Why would a man who'd defined himself by power suddenly walk away? Unless... She booked the flight that night. No entourage, no press, just her. And a scarf, the one she left behind. The estate was quieter than she remembered. No staff, no guests, just one light glowing from the greenhouse. She stepped inside, and there he was, seated exactly where she'd last seen him, as if time had folded into itself. He didn't look surprised to see her, just relieved, like his body had finally exhaled after days of holding its breath. Clara spoke first. "You stepped down." Julian nodded once. There's no point in building empires when the one person who made them matter is gone. Tears burned in her eyes. "You didn't have to give everything up." "I didn't. I just gave up pretending it meant anything without you." She stepped forward, heart pounding in her chest. His eyes searched hers, not for answers, but for permission. She gave it. With a breath, with a whisper, with the smallest step forward. Julian reached out and took her hand. Neither spoke. There were no apologies big enough, no speeches rehearsed. Just this moment. A moment where forgiveness wasn't begged, it was given.
Later that night, they sat on the floor of the greenhouse, backs against the wall, legs tangled, rain tapping gently against the glass. He touched her face like he still couldn't believe she was real. She whispered against his shoulder, "This wasn't supposed to happen." He kissed her hair. But it did. It was barely morning. Mist curled over the gardens, wrapping the estate in a hush that felt like a held breath. In the greenhouse, dew clung to the glass, and on the floor, side by side on a blanket of tangled limbs and truth, Julian and Clara lay in the softest silence. For once, neither of them felt the need to run. Julian stirred first. Clara's head rested on his shoulder, her hand still tangled in his shirt. Her breathing was steady. He could have watched her sleep forever if he weren't terrified of what might come next. But then she opened her eyes and smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile people gave billionaires. It was the kind that said, "I see you, not your empire." They didn't say much as they moved through the day. Breakfast was quiet, soft eggs, black coffee, no questions. It was peace, awkward, beautiful peace. Until Julian finally asked, as they walked past the west corridor window, "What's your real name?" Clara froze. Then slowly she turned to face him. Her voice was steady but soft. Clara Margot Leclair. She hadn't said it aloud in over a year. The sound of it made her feel like both a ghost and a girl reborn. Julian stepped closer.
"Leclair," he repeated. "The empire your father built." Clara nodded. He searched her face. "And what do you want me to do with that name?" "Nothing," she whispered. "I just want you to know it." Later, they stood in the gallery where Julian kept pieces he never showed guests. Rare sculptures, forgotten paintings, quiet things. He showed her a canvas hidden behind an old velvet curtain. It was unfinished. A woman, half-painted. No eyes, no face, just the gesture of longing. "I bought this 10 years ago," he said. "Never knew why." Clara looked at the woman's silhouette. Her throat tightened. "She's waiting for someone." Or, he said, finally letting someone see her. They kissed there. Not the way they had once imagined it, but real, raw, gentle, brave. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. That night, Clara lay in Julian's bed for the first time. The rain outside was soft, not a storm, just a song. He traced her name across her back with his fingertips. Clara Margot Leclair. She turned to him. "I've never told anyone that name without regret." Julian kissed her palm. "Then I'll make sure it's the last name you say without fear." The first photograph leaked on a Monday. A grainy shot of Julian and Clara walking hand in hand outside a quiet antique bookstore in Montmartre. She wore no makeup, no designer labels, just a white linen dress and laughter on her lips. But it was enough. By Tuesday, tabloids had headlines. Julian Blackwell's mystery girl identified as missing heiress Clara Leclair. From Maid to Mogul, a billionaire's love story. Revenge romance inside the scandal at Blackwell Holdings? Julian was furious. Not because they found out, but because they tried to reduce Clara to a headline again. He slammed the paper down in his office and said, "They're going to chew you up." Clara stood by the window, arms crossed, calm. "Let them. You don't have to do this." She turned, her eyes soft but unwavering. "I'm tired of hiding. I lived as a ghost long enough. If they want a story, I'll give them mine." They held the press conference 3 days later. A garden setting, small, controlled. No staged romance, just truth. Julian took the first question, about corporate ethics, about betrayal. He handled it like a professional. But when they turned to Clara and someone shouted, "Why did you lie about who you were?" the hush that followed could have cracked glass. She didn't flinch. "I never lied," she said. "I just stopped explaining." The silence deepened. And then, applause. Not from the press, from Julian. Slow, defiant. And when he stood beside her, took her hand in front of the cameras, he didn't kiss her. He looked at her, like she was the truth he'd waited his whole life to find. That night, back at the estate, Clara found an envelope on her pillow. Inside, a deed. Her family's original winery estate, the one lost during the collapse, quietly purchased back under her name. Julian's note was simple. Some things deserve to come home. She found him outside under the stars, said nothing, just kissed him. And for once, the world didn't matter. Because the story they were writing now wasn't for the world. It was for them. They didn't rush. Not into marriage, not into mergers, not into the next grand chapter of their story. They just lived. Together. Clara returned to her father's vineyard that spring. The vines were overgrown. The house cracked with silence. But she walked through it with purpose. Clipboard in one hand, Julian's jacket wrapped around her shoulders, dirt on her boots, and fire in her eyes. She wasn't a Leclair in name only anymore. She was rebuilding what had once been lost, not from grief, but from love. Julian didn't interfere. He didn't offer investors or architects. He just showed up every weekend, rolled up his sleeves, and followed her lead. He planted vines, hauled crates, ate lunch in the fields beside her, sitting cross-legged like a schoolboy. They got sunburned, muddy, stung by bees. And they laughed, loud, real laughter, the kind Julian never knew he was capable of. One evening, after a long day restoring the cellar, they collapsed on a blanket beneath the oak tree Clara once climbed as a child. "I want to build something," she whispered. "You already are." "No, I mean with you." Julian turned to her, brows raised. "A life?" he asked. Clara nodded. "A life that's not built on secrets or boardrooms." He pulled her hand to his chest. "Then let's build slow." The next morning, he surprised her with a simple wooden sign. Burned into it, Maison Margot. She blinked at it. "You named it after me?" "I named it after the version of you who never stopped fighting for her family." That week, they hosted their first harvest dinner. Not for investors, not for legacy. Just the vineyard workers, local chefs, friends. Long tables, fresh food, strings of warm lights between the trees. Julian carved the roast. Clara poured the wine. And no one called her Maid. They called her Madame. And Julian? He smiled more in that single night than he had in 35 years of life. After the guests left, Clara curled into his lap on the porch. They looked out at the hills, golden and breathing. "I never imagined this," she murmured. "I did," he whispered, "the moment you told me your real name." The house was almost silent now. A year had passed since Clara reopened the vineyard. Maison Margot had grown, not into a business empire, but into something stronger, a home. Julian walked through the hallways that morning with a coffee in hand and a letter in his jacket. He hadn't opened it yet, not really. It was from Clara's father, found in a hidden drawer behind an old ledger in the wine library. Labeled only, "For my daughter, when she's free." Clara stood at the French doors overlooking the vineyard. She didn't hear Julian walk up, but she felt him. He gently placed the letter in her hands, said nothing. She looked at him. "Are you sure?" "It was always yours," he replied. She opened it. "My dearest Margot, if you're reading this, it means you made it through the storm, the silence, the heartbreak. I worried I raised you to be too soft, but now, I see, I raised you to be kind in a world that isn't, and that is a harder kind of strength. Don't let the world tell you who you are. You were never just a daughter, or an heiress, or a bride. You were always going to be the one who rebuilt what I could not. And if, by some miracle, you found love again, don't question it, don't punish it, just let it stay. Because that, my darling, is the one thing even I couldn't leave you, but always hoped you'd find. I love you. Always. Dada. Tears fell, silent and sure. Julian wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing his cheek to her hair. No words, just breath, just presence. That afternoon, Clara unlocked the last room in the house, the old chapel behind the vineyard. Abandoned, dusty, forgotten. She swept the floor, one motion at a time. Julian joined her, no questions. Together, they restored it. Not because they needed a wedding, but because they wanted a promise. Weeks later, they stood inside that little stone room, just the two of them, and a fire crackling in the old hearth. She wore no gown, he wore no tux. But when they spoke their vows, whispered, honest, trembling with truth, it felt more sacred than any altar could offer. Julian cupped her face. You once said you were a ghost. Clara smiled through tears. And you said I brought you peace. I was wrong. She blinked. You were? You brought me home. Outside, the vines stretched in quiet rows. Inside, they kissed. And for the first time in both their lives, they didn't just survive their story.
They rewrote it. Together,